Good evening, everyone. Yeah! I'm so excited about tonight, so I'm glad to hear that. Keep it up. My name is Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Art Practice. We are pleased to host Rashaad Newsome's lecture today for Arts and Design Mondays, a weekly series coordinated by the Office of Berkeley Arts and Design, which is led by Associate Vice Chancellor Shannon Jackson. And we are particularly grateful to the A&D office for supporting the staff and space costs of BAM so that we can host our amazing speakers in this beautiful theater. Yes, so beautiful. I want to add that this event is also being supported by the Department of Art Practice, Wiesenfeld Lecture Series, and the Art, Technology, and Culture Colloquium. The next event for the Wiesenfeld Lecture Series is this Wednesday, April 24th, for artist Nikki Green from 6:30 to 8 p.m., room 285 in Kroeber Hall. Now I'll read Rashaad's bio. Rashaad Newsome lives and works in New York City. He was born in 1979 in New Orleans. Is it New Orleans? New Orleans. Louisiana. I had to rep it right for you, Rashaad. Where he received a BFA in art history at Tulane University in 2001. In 2004, he received a certificate of study in digital post-production from Film Video Arts Incorporated in New York City. In 2005, he studied with, is it MSP? Yes, I got the acronyms right. Programming at Harvest Works Digital Media Arts Center, also in New York City. He has exhibited and performed in galleries, museums, institutions, and festivals throughout the world, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, the Whitney Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, MoMA PS1, SF MoMA, the New Orleans Museum of Art, the Centre Georges Pompidou, or the Pompidou in Paris, the Garage Center of Museum Art, the Garage Center for Contemporary Culture, in Moscow, and Musa in Vienna. Newsome's work is in numerous public collections, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Brooklyn Museum of Art, the SF MoMA, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the LACMA, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, McNay Art Museum in Texas, the Chazen Museum of Art in Wisconsin, and the New Britain Museum of Art, the New Britain Museum of American Art. Oh my gosh, you have all of these amazing museums in Connecticut. In 2010, he participated in the Whitney Biennial, and in 2011, the Greater New York Show at MoMA PS1. He has many honors and awards for his work that include a 2018 William Penn Foundation grant, the 2018 Live Feed Creative Residency at New York Live Arts, a 2017 Pollock Krasner Foundation grant, a 2017 Rush Arts Gold Rush Award, the 2016 Artist in Residence at the Tamarind Institute in New Mexico, the 2014 Headland Center for the Arts Visiting Artist Residency, a 2011 Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Award, a 2010 Urban Artist Initiative Individual Artist Grant, and a 2009 Rima Hortman Foundation Visual Artist Grant. Rashaad will have a solo show in the fall of 2019 at MOAD in San Francisco and a solo show at Fort Mason in spring 2020. Rashaad is a multidisciplinary artist whose work blends several practices together, including collage, sculpture, film, museum, computer programming, and performance, to form an altogether new field. He pulls intuitively from the world of advertising, the internet, Black and queer culture to produce counter-hegemonic works that use the diasporic traditions of improvisation and collage to craft compositions that walk the tightrope between intersectionality, social practice, and abstraction. Newsome's work is deeply invested in how images used in media and popular culture communicate distorted notions of power. He draws attention to the contributions that marginalized communities, whose culture is often absorbed and co-opted by mainstream advertising platforms, have made to popular culture and society in general. Through his visually engaging and truly interdisciplinary work, Newsome explores the complexities of social power structures and questions of agency. During his talk, Newsome will discuss his use of the diasporic tradition of improvisation and collage as a tool to achieve abstraction. At the heart of his practice is the tenacity and resilience of marginalized communities to create globally celebrated cultural productions, despite living within what scholar Bell Hooks names the capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist patriarchy. His work speaks to the power of the human spirit to reinvent and transform itself, as evidenced in the Black and queer cultural practices referenced and abstracted throughout the work. Please give it up for Rashaad Newsome.
Wow, that was a mouthful. Thank you so much, Kenyatta. Thank you, Kenyatta, and the Department of Art Practice, and everybody who came out tonight. Let's get this set up. So I titled this talk Black Magic because for the last 5 years, I've been asking myself the question of what is the work about, which is a complicated question because work can be about many different things at many different times. But when sort of forcing myself to answer that question, what I came to is this constant search for this sort of Black euphoria that I've come to call Black magic. I believe it is found in the tenacity and resilience of Black folk to create globally celebrated cultural productions under very harsh physical, emotional, and economic conditions. When experiencing Black cultural production, there is often this moment of transcendence. That is what I'm trying to tap into and bring to my audience. I believe that euphoria can be seen in the improvisational space of jazz, the resistance of hip hop and Vogue film performance, as well as the transcendent nature of vocal runs in R&B music. I believe that all of these things are sort of a coping mechanism to survive in the complicated space that Black practitioners of art occupy. And so I want to show you a video that is a very, very, very early video of mine, which for me was like really the beginnings of me starting to think about this whole idea of Black magic and trying to tap into that. So that video was kind of personal. The video came from me thinking a lot about when I was growing up and we would be in church and there was this one particular woman named Bernadine. And Bernadine every Sunday would like get up and she would get the Holy Ghost and she would just like run up and down the aisle and she was always like in this kind of like state of euphoria because she was so connected to the word that she was getting. And I was always really fascinated, and I went just to watch her. And so for me, when I was having that memory, I was thinking I wanted to sort of bring whatever that was that she was experiencing into my work in some kind of way. And so it ended up being this video, which is footage from, a lot of it came from a film called Say Amen, but it's all scenes from people in that state of rapture. And then the audio is in reverse. The audio is actually a song by the Barrett sisters from Chicago, which is this really incredible gospel music trio. And it said that when you play music backwards, it's the devil's music. So I wanted to sort of, kind of, it was sort of a queering of this type of imagery. In 2005, I was doing a residency in Paris, and at the time, the residency was centered on ethnographic research for another project called Shade Compositions. But I had this great studio, and I wanted to figure out a way to activate the studio. And so at the time, I hadn't really been making object-based work. It had all been performance and video. Excuse me. And so I was thinking a lot about architecture. And so I was traveling around looking at different architectural spaces. This is from Versailles, the gate outside. And I was traveling, I was based in Paris, but I was traveling to Italy, to Spain, to London, and just looking at all these different architectural spaces and looking at these spaces, actually looking at the architectural ornament introduced me to heraldry. And I became really fascinated with heraldry as a design formula. And I was thinking a lot about the culture of domination and the ways in which the culture of domination teaches us that how to think about power in a way as I will get this amazing car, this amazing partner, clothing, jewelry, body, skin tone, hair texture, or amazing amount of money as a way to have power. So power is always conceived as power over something and not what is our power within. And so I thought the design formula of heraldry would be a really great way to sort of explore the way the culture of domination is at play in our lives. Essentially, heraldry is an image made of images that represent rank, status, position, and pedigree within popular culture of that particular time. So this is an early work from that series, and this one is based on the Royal Coat of Arms of England. This is the original. And so the lion and the unicorn have been sort of rebuilt, but all using material from hip-hop magazines, catalogs, the internet. Basically, I wanted to work with images, found images that represent distorted notions of power, like jewelry and clothing and money and all these sort of materialistic things that we're constantly being bombarded with every day. This particular piece is really important because this one is when I started to move away from working from an original image and just work intuitively. And I chose this one as the second one because in a lot of ways, this is the beginning of where the work is now. It was sort of me starting to think about the feminist voice in the work. In a lot of ways I was looking, I'm using images, consumed images, and women's bodies have been consumed, for as long as we can remember, particularly when you're looking through the lens of Black youth culture, i.e. hip hop. And so I wanted to bring that conversation into the work. And I actually had the pleasure of interviewing the woman on the left, who is her name is Buffy Caruth. She went by Buffy the Body in around 2005. She was like the top video vixen and urban model. And I came to know her because at the time I was working on another project called The Conductor, in which I was remixing Carl Orff's Carmina Burana, using samples from popular hip hop music of the time. And so I'm looking at thousands and thousands and thousands of hip hop videos, and at a certain point, you start to glaze over and you just start to see the formula of the way the images are built. And there's sort of like this central male figure, and they're sort of flanked by all these females. And it just became this, this formula. And I was thinking a lot about, if you take the females out, the image is actually not that important. And so while the women are being consumed, there is sort of this power that's there too, because without their presence, the image just kind of falls apart. And so that was sort of what I was thinking about when creating this image, but I hadn't really sorted through that yet. But this was really the beginning of, again, where the work is now. This is a sculpture that was in my first show, which was based on a lot of the wrought iron grills that I had experienced during my time in Europe. But again, doing what I was doing with the collage work, but in a 3D format. And so as I continued to make that work, I was sort of developing my own language of heraldry. And so I had a friend who knew someone at the Royal College of Arms. And so I had been doing my own study of heraldry. And I reached out to the Royal College of Arms and got a meeting with Sir William Hunt, who was the current King of Arms, and convinced him to shoot a video with me. And I did this video called Pursuivant. Pursuivant is the junior ranking officer of arms. Officers of arms are the people who grant and blazon coats of arms. So, you can sort of go to them and you can give your last name and they'll find like the earliest known coat of arms with that name, and then you can get it made for you, or you can change it, and you get it by way of a legal document called a letters patent. And so as I was kind of creating my own language of heraldry, I thought it'd be great and actually kind of funny to get it validated by the Royal College of Arms. And so I went there and shot this video. And for me, really, it wasn't really about getting any validation from them. It was much more to give the audience a little bit of the art historical reference in the work around heraldry, because I feel like the pop culture references were very clear. And so the video consists of me and William in the library, and then we weren't able to film in the chamber where all the really old coat of arms are, because no one is allowed to film in there. But I got to go in there and look at all these incredible coats of arms, which was really a real treat. And the video consists of him breaking down the history of heraldry. And so, it consists of me going there, me going to the library, spending time with him breaking down the history of heraldry, and then the video ends with me going back to New York, and I get knighted with my community to become a Pursuivant of Arms. And that video, which started as kind of like a one-of video to sort of educate the viewer about that art historical reference, sort of inspired me to kind of keep going with that project. I felt like, okay, there was this this line of Pursuivant, Herald, King of Arms, which is this sort of patriarchal structure. And I thought maybe I can use this as like a visual trope to every time I shift from one rank to another, that can sort of be a visual trope of a shift in the work. And I can use that sort of like to create a story, a beginning, middle, and end. And so this video is really what launched that whole series, the Herald series. And so with this first video, the accompanying collage works were when I introduced frames, because in a lot of ways I was reframing the history of heraldry. And so at the time, I was collecting neoclassical and Baroque frames and restoring them and adding imagery that you would see in the collage to the frame, and then gilding them. And so at first glance, they seem like antique frames, but as you continue to explore them, you see that they've been updated. The second show, I decided to focus on tournament. And so there was there was a second video called Herald, which is the second in that trilogy, but all the works related to that video kind of dealt with one of the roles of the heralds, which was to organize the tournament and keep the score. And I was thinking just a lot about the work that I was doing with the Vogue community and how so much of that is about battling, but then also the work that I was doing in the conductor around hip hop culture and how MCs battle. And I wanted to kind of bring that whole idea of tournament into the picture. And so there was this tension between the foreground, the background, the picture plane, and the frame. There would be elements coming out of the frame into the room and then back into another piece. Also part of this exhibition, as part of this exhibition, I held a rap joust where I invited local MCs in New York to battle it out in the gallery for a cash prize and studio time at Harvestworks, which was a place where I was doing a residency. This is another work from that series. Again, playing with foreground and background. The background is all made up of images of hair weave in motion as a way to kind of mimic brushstroke. And all the flowers were based on the stock colors of Ferraris. And this was also when I introduced automotive paint to the frames. Before they were in gilded frames, and I was thinking a lot about how I can kind of bring my own spin to this whole idea of gilding. But then also there was like this personal reference. I'm from New Orleans, so there was a big Southern car culture there, and a lot of my early introductions to people being creative. There weren't like a lot of visual artists where I was from, but there were people who took pride in their car or certain things that they had, and they would customize them, and they were being creative in their own way. And so that was my way of sort of like an homage to those early introductions to Black folk being creative outside of the canonized art world. This is a image of the video Herald. With this video, with the framing, I wanted, because again, I was continuing this whole idea of battling, and so there was several types of ornament that had been collaged together to create this frame. So it was sort of like the frame was trying to eat the picture plane. This is an installation shot. And now I'll show you a clip from that video. So with that video, it really marked a shift in the work because I wanted to move from working with the material in an analog way and work with it more digitally. My most formal training is in post-production, so I wanted to kind of, utilize those muscles in my practice. And so rather than making, paper collage, I started to scan the images and film myself on green screen and start to collage those images together in post and create these video collages. And so that was really a real big shift in the work. And it was really inspiring because moving to After Effects and using planes as a way to create our fake dimension really helped me when I went back to the analog process, because what I started to do then was use physical planes in the work. So for instance, with this work, all these different layers are on different planes. And so in reproduction, it might look flat, but it's quite three-dimensional. So it's sort of taking it into the digital space and faking dimension actually inspired dimension in the physical work. And this work was a part of the third body of work related to the Herald series. And this was shown in my solo show in my hometown, New Orleans. And that show, when I shifted from Herald to King of Arms, this was sort of the end of this narrative arc in the work. And it was great because I was taking it home. And I was thinking a lot about, I was like going back home, and I was thinking about what originally inspired the work, which was, looking at architecture and looking at architectural ornament. And so I was thinking a lot about architecture and also how much I was working with the Baroque. And I was thinking a lot about the beginnings of the Baroque, which started in the Basilica, and thinking about these religious spaces. So again, going back to this whole like spiritual euphoria thing was still kind of percolating in my mind. And this work marked a shift in that sense, but then also I wanted to move away from the body being as present as it was. And I was thinking a lot about, how in Baroque spaces, there's the connections to the body, like the Vitruvian principle within the dome, but then also the ribbed vaults, and just how connected those spaces were to the body. And so I thought that was a good way to have the body be present without the body being formally present. This is another detail of that work. This is another piece from that series. This one was called Rapture, where I was really much more focused on the dome. This one was dedicated to my mother, actually. And this one was also inspired by the when I went back to do research for the show, I was looking at a lot of the works in the collection, and the museum had a really big collection of Meissen china. And I just remember like growing up and always seeing that stuff on Royal Street, and some people think it's like super gaudy and kind of cheesy, but I always loved that stuff. I thought it was so beautifully made with all the scalloping and everything. And so I wanted to bring that aesthetic into the frame. The piece was called P3110, which is this Bible verse about a virtuous woman. And it was sort of just like an homage to, one of the virtuous women in my life. This is a detail. Work. This is another work from that series. This one was called Wild Magnolia. And with this one, I was trying to play with the space. There is a work in the frame, but the frame, when it's on the wall, almost appears like it's a window. So I was kind of playing with this whole idea of like a stained glass window. And the frame is comprised of all these flowers that are often not depicted in the filigree and fauna found in Baroque ornament, but more like tropical flowers. And all of them have been cast and made in resin and then painted in this custom candy paint that was sort of inspired by king cakes from New Orleans. So as part of that show, rather than like the previous shows where I showed the body of work connected to the video, I decided to use the museum as the location to shoot the video. And at this point, I had developed a lot of performance work like shade compositions in 5, but they were these performances that were coming from a very modernist perspective where you sit and you watch. And where I was from, performance was always something you can kind of come in and out of, and it was very interactive. And so I wanted, it was that theme of sort of like going back and kind of thinking about what had inspired me early on. And so I thought about mass processional performance, and then also the tons of stories that I heard about the museum and how in certain periods, certain people weren't able to come into the museum. And so I felt like being able to have that show there, I wanted to just kind of bring everybody into the space. And so from that, the King of Arms mass processional performance was born. And the way it happened was there was a work called 5 in which I work with Vogue performers. And I had been doing this work in museums and galleries, and I was thinking a lot about how that particular work was being framed, and how sometimes people would say, oh, Rashaad is bringing Vogue into the museum. And it was sort of framing it almost like what I was doing with Vogue film performance was interesting adjacent to hegemonic work seen in museums. And that's not at all what I was trying to do. I was celebrating, a part of my community and a culture that I was a part of. And so I wanted to do something that was sort of outside that whole structure. And so I worked only with the people in community and started my own ball, which is called the King of Arms Art Ball. The next one will be this November in Philadelphia. And I call it the Art Ball because all of the categories are based on a particular artist's work or a moment in art history. And so it's kind of bringing two worlds that I'm a part of together, like the Vogue world and then also the art world. And the judges panel is split between people that are legends within that community, but also people that are tastemakers and influencers within art, fashion, music, the literary world, activism. And so the first ball happened a couple of months before the show was going to open. And it was during Mardi Gras time. And I was thinking, well, right now, all Mardi Gras crews are having their Mardi Gras balls. And so I was having this ball, so this was going to be my Mardi Gras crew. So that's how the King of Arms crew was born. And so we had the ball, and then when I went down for the show, we did the procession. And the procession was, it sort of acts as a social sculpture that brings together several aspects of my work. We had the Mardi Gras Indians of the Treme, McMain High School Band, which is a really acclaimed brass band in New Orleans. And we also had the White Eagle War Tribe, which is a Mardi Gras Indian troupe based in New Orleans. And these were just all different aspects of my history that I just wanted to bring together and celebrate as part of this show, as part of my coronation ceremony. And so we started from the beginning of City Park, and we paraded into the museum, where I was then knighted by my longtime collaborators, Ronika Prodigy and Julie Gainey. Julie Gainey is a queer woman who has been collaborating with me on all my performance work in terms of like the beauty and the styling. And Ronika Prodigy has been the voice of most of my animated videos and Vogue work for about a decade now. And so I wanted my coronation to be knighted by the folks who essentially helped put me up in that space, right? So it's sort of a celebration for all of us. That video became an installation later. This is an installation shot. And here's a clip from the video. Oops, it's not.
As you walk on the road that brings to the king, I was the one tonight. Kneel and never so slightly, left to the right tonight. Your ceremony all hail to the king, the originator of the one mind blank. I'm right in a custom Italian thing. We bow down tonight, go sing. King to the king, king to the king, the king of forms tonight, go sing. The king to the king, 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 king. I'm right in a custom Italian thing. King to the king, king of forms. We bow down tonight, go sing. The king to the king, to the king, king, king. Tonight, go sing. King to the king, king, oh, king to the king, king, oh, king to the king, king, oh, and make this shit real hot, hot, hot. Now king to the king, king, over. Now king to the king and make it. Now king to the king, king, oh, you ready, ready, As you dance to the king, perform for the king, as he sits on the throne. Watch your tongue, no disrespect, no sweat my head. Tonight we're gonna vote in this bed. Into the bottom, into the floor. Turn up the elements, move over you up the bitch you so slow. Stumble, no, no, take your blue feather, you clap your ears. Fear, with my dear, I wanna see you get sense here. I wanna see you get. I wanna see you get. I wanna see you get. Get sense here. I wanna see you get. I wanna see you get. I wanna see you get.
So that work, also I should say the float for the King of Arms Parade was a Lamborghini Murcielago that I wrapped in a vinyl that was the background for one of the works in the show. And the way that happened was the body shop in New York where I get my frames painted, because they're painted the same way cars are painted in a body shop, is actually, some of you might be familiar with the show that used to be on MTV called Full Throttle. And it was hosted by Funkmaster Flex, and the show would consist of him interviewing a rapper, and while he did that, their car would be customized. And so I got to meet Flex and told him that I was looking for a body shop to start painting my frames, because it was quite difficult. You know, I was looking for a shop, and I would go to all these shops, and I would be like, yeah, I want to paint this frame, and they would just be like, what? They didn't really understand what I wanted to do, and they didn't know how to price it. And so he put me in touch with the shop in the Bronx. And actually, the owner of the shop did the first frame of mine, but he's like super inundated with jobs. And so he had been grooming his daughter to basically take over the business. And so she was going to college. And so she was just as good as him. And so she set up a side business within the shop, painting the frames for me. And so I've been working with them for years now. And they had a collection of, you know, like supercars, and they had this car and it was there. And, you know, the owner of the shop used to be a painter, and he was a a creative person, but he, went into the family business and never really sort of got to, I guess, live out his artistic life in this sense. And so I thought it was a great way for us to collaborate in a little bit more on his side. And so we collaborated on the car, we wrapped it in the vinyl, he customized the rims, and that became the float for the parade. And actually went on to be in the Dub Show in Vegas and traveled around the nation. The project I continue to do this project because I see the King of Arms processional performance as another collage. It's just a collage of people. And so, yeah, it's sort of like this social sculpture that I continue to bring to different cities. This is a clip from the one I did in Miami. And I've gone on to do it in Detroit as well. These are some images from the Detroit iteration. And really the way it works is, I go to a space and connect to the Black community in that space and just galvanize. So it's just a lot of organizing. I always start with the floats, which are a reference to, again, that history of car culture. So I just go around and meet guys who, have put a lot of work into their cars, and they sort of act as my floats for the parade. And then I also, each one is kind of customized. If there's a certain aspect of that particular place, I'll try to bring that into the parade. Like, for instance, in the Miami version, Miami has like a strong dirt bike and ATV community where these guys take these dirt bikes and ATVs on the road, actually illegally, but they are like incredible. These kids have no fear, and some of you probably have seen them online, but it's a whole like bike life community, and they do these insane Hollywood level stunts, but none of them have any real like formal training in doing that kind of work. And oftentimes they get arrested. And so when I got, part of being able to do this project is I get a permit to take over a part of town. And so I thought, it would be a great way to give them space to do what they do. And so, yeah, it's just literally going into the community and galvanizing and bringing everybody together and then just taking over a space. And it's been a real dear project for me because it kind of showed how seemingly desperate communities can come together through art. Because, I'm bringing together, voguing kids from New York, queer voguing kids from New York, and trans kids from New York with like, D-boys who have like these souped up cars. And in the Detroit one, we even had, because, Detroit has this big gospel community. I'm much more of a spiritual person rather than a religious person, but because that was such a part of that city, we even had the local Baptist church come and ride with us. And so most of the time these communities don't intersect, but the beauty of this project is that through the project they do, and the hope is that they will continue after we do this. Here are some more stills from that. And so as I continued, and so sort of went back to the collage work, I wanted to further explore animation as a tool, but kind of pushing it even further. And I made this video called Icon. Again, kind of piggybacking on the work that was in the New Orleans show about architecture, but bringing the body back into the work, but in the form of animation. And this time moving from After Effects, where I'm sort of faking dimension, and moving into Maya, where I'm actually creating 3D environments, filming performers on green screen, and then creating these video collages that are a synthesis of actual people that have been shot, 3D designed environments, visual effects, and scanned imagery brought into the composition as well. This is a clip from that video. Thank you. Thank you. That video was sort of continuing what I was doing with the 2D collage work, and in some ways it's a live action version of them. And I was thinking a lot about icons because I was using this religious space, but for me, icon takes on a new meaning in this work. In a lot of ways, it's sort of a icon. Also, in the Vogue community, you have these ranks. You have a statement, legend, and icon. Those are like the different ranks you come up in as a Vogue femme performer. So that's sort of, it has a dual meaning. It means icon because all of the performers in the video are icons in the ballroom scene, but also it's sort of a loving portrait of the folks that inspire me in my work. So it's sort of like them as an icon. I'm going to show another video clip. This is from the video I spoke about earlier, The Conductor. And the conductor, whoops, got a little technical stuff going on. Okay, so in the conductor, I'm sorry, I was playing with sort of high and low culture, but in this case, and both of those come in quotations for me. But in this case, I was borrowing from Carmina Burana, which is based on these medieval poems that, in my opinion, mirror the lyrics of popular hip hop music, specifically in the content of the messages contained in the lyrics, like the fickleness and fortune of wealth, the ephemeral nature of life, and the pleasures and perils of drinking, gluttony, gambling, lust, and rebirth. And I wanted to kind of bring these two seemingly desperate things together. The way it started was I did a survey with the local hip hop station Hot 97 and 105.1, and to find out who the interns of the station and listeners consider to be the most epic MCs and producers in that genre, because Carmina Burana is the most epic choral piece to date. From this data, I collected videos from those artists and motion tracked the central artist's hand movements frame by frame. And then also for the audio, I sort of took samples from that music and used those samples found consistently in that production, like certain types of 808s or certain types of hi-hats and kicks, to remix that particular movement. This piece was created over the course of about 3 years because it is an intense editing process, because there are thousands and thousands and thousands of videos that I motion track the hand movements of these artists frame by frame to create the library, to create the moving image. And then also, so to me, the piece in totality is a sort of portrait of hip hop culture in all its beauty and folly. And because it took several years to make, the videos changed over time. So you also see how you see how the production value changes. You see how there's more of an investment in the culture, but you also see certain trends sonically when times when there was more of a West Coast sound or a Southern sound or an East Coast sound. And so the piece is really a portrait of the growth of hip hop music from like the 90s to now. It's quite a long piece, but I'll show an excerpt from it. This is the third movement in the piece. right. This is a installation shot of that work. And so the video is in a room, and each movement is assigned to a wall, and it sort of moves around the viewer. And the final movement moves away from hands that have been motion tracked and edited, like the clip I showed you before, but to my hands, which have been multiplied, and they sort of create this flurry of hands moving around the viewer, and it becomes completely immersive. Because hip hop culture is not very friendly to the queer community, a lot of queer rappers didn't come through the research or the data that I comprised from the stations. So as a sort of response to that, whenever the work is shown, I invite queer rappers to perform on the opening night within the installation, and I give them the music of the sixth movement to write something to. And so so it sort of inserts that body into the work. These are some images of when it was shown in Times Square. And this is a queer rapper named Cakes the Killer, who I invited to perform on the opening night. So the work, after sort of leaving that whole narrative of heraldry and and sort of exploring the culture of domination, I was thinking a lot about how the work was sort of operating in this kind of surrealist space aesthetically, or even a cubist aesthetic. The works started to move away from being images that were like symbols, but rather images that were much more like faces. And they started to look that way because I was thinking a lot about agency and how that was a consistent theme in the work. And I thought a great way to kind of start that conversation in the work would be to give the work a face so it can look back to start this conversation about agency. And when thinking about how to kind of create those pictures, rather than looking at people like Hannah Hoch and Picasso, whose work I love, I looked at who they owed a debt to, which was African art, which is the true beginnings of Cubism, and in a lot of ways abstraction as we understand it in the visual space. So I was looking at a lot of African masks as a source of inspiration, but then also stills from past performances that I was doing with the Vogue performers, and then also just the visual lexicon that I was working from in the earlier work. And so these are some of the images from that body of work. And these works were all part of a show called Stop Playing in My Face. And the show was called Stop Playing in My Face because there's this trans woman named Samantha James Revlon, who at the time I was always watching her YouTube videos in my studio as I was working. And as these faces were emerging in my works, one day this video came on where she kept saying, "Stop playing in my face." And the video was essentially her talking about how in the past people had done her makeup and they tried to sabotage her, and she was just sort of saying, if you can't depict me the way that I see myself, stop playing in my face. And I thought that was like a great line in terms of thinking about this show, because I was thinking a lot about agency, and I was thinking a lot about her and how I was kind of trying to sort of come up with the feminist voice in the work. And I wanted to kind of stay away from the word feminist because I felt like there were so many people left out of that movement, particularly Black people. And so And then I was thinking about how, in some ways, there are certain people who it's hard for them to access that particular concept. And so my idea was a more intersectional idea of feminism. So rather than it being feminism, it was much more a conversation about agency and how important agency is for all people. And I was thinking about how oftentimes our ideas of what agency is and can be is often rooted in what our privileges are in life. And so I'm thinking about Samantha James Rosal, who is this trans woman, and how, she's this Black trans woman, and how does she access agency in the world? And she, has this YouTube video series that she does on her phone, and she has people send her money directly so she can do it. So you take someone like that who one would think, how do they access agency? But there was sort of this rogue form of agency. It's sort of how she's just kind of taking space in the world and creating upward mobility for herself. And so I found that really inspiring. I was really interested in how people outside of academia, people who don't get to go to college and study about Gloria Steinem and Judith Butler and the amazing Bell Hooks, how do they come to these concepts, like in the video vixen world, like Buffy, and who went on to become a millionaire from selling her own image and making workout tapes, and this is all pre-Kim Kardashian. And Samantha, and then also a lot of the people that have appeared in my work. And then also when I am making these images, I'm looking at stills from Vogue performances, but the image library I'm working from doesn't have those bodies in the work. And so I'm using cis bodies to create these trans forms that are inspired by African mass. So again, there's this really this collage of all these seemingly desperate material. This particular image was important to the show because I was thinking about how, using the mosque as the top of the head in Islam, you will never see God depicted. It's always done using abstraction. And I was thinking about how to depict this queer body. How do you create a body when the body doesn't exist in the world? You resort to abstraction. And so I thought that was a great way to kind of bring that in, to think about, to start that conversation. And then also the architectural references, which in the previous work were really about sort of a surrogate for the body, took on a new meaning. It was, for me in this work, it was much more about the building of the self when the self doesn't exist in the world. These are more images from that work. And so the anchor of that show was a video called Stop Playing in My Face, in which I collaborated with, Leomi Maldonado, who's also known as the Wonder Woman of Vogue. She's probably the most celebrated and internationally known Vogue film performer. She's a trans woman, and I wanted to bring the trans body into the show, even though I wasn't finding those images in the image library I was working from. I thought it would be a great way to kind of bring that trans body into the show and have it be sort of like the anchor of the exhibition. And so we collaborated on this video. And actually, the video started with me taking one of the collages from the show and created it in Maya, and then filming her and have her sort of hold court over this collage. And it seems like an architectural space at first, but as the camera zooms out, you see that it's actually a face, and the face is talking, and the face is an amalgamation. Well, the voice is a amalgamation of several different people: Janet Mock, Bell Hooks, Marcia Blackman, Lena Dunham, and it's an ongoing project. But those were the voices that I used in that particular video, and part of it was early early people who identified as trans were considered to have multiple personality disorders. So it was a way to kind of talk about that and the disparities in terms of like the healthcare community around dealing with the trans community. But then also, I was thinking a lot about how those voices collectively spoke to my ideas of feminism and agency. Because, you know, I don't think that there is, I think it's a very complicated idea, and there's not really one way. And I felt like they collectively kind of spoke to my ideas, but they didn't all necessarily agree. But I like the idea of bringing these voices together and to kind of show how we can agree to disagree, sort of. So here's a clip from that work.
Prepared to fight a madman, and instead you found a god?
I'll give you the definition of stop playing in my face. I'll give you the definition of stop playing in my face. I'll give you the definition of stop playing in my face.
Using the same images that were used against us for so many years and taking control over and then saying, if y'all are gonna make money off of it, so am I.
Giving you New York City full coverage cunt. Bitch, giving you Harlem cunt. Giving you Brooklyn cunt. Staten Island cunt. Uptown cunt. Queens cunt. Yes, that's right, Bronx coverage cunt. Giving you New York City full coverage television cunt, bitch. Stop playing in my fucking face.
Are you still a slave? Are you still a slave? Are you still a slave? How do we begin to free the black girl body, the black boy body before they have undergone years and years of emotional assault and colonization? How do we free ourselves from those images to claim a different set of imaging?
When did you become so weak?
Stop playing in my face, girl.
Weak. Afraid.
She's colluding in the construction of herself as a slave. It's not a liberatory image.
Look, girl.
That's awful. I thought you'd be brave. I thought you'd be adventurous, fearless, sexy, confident, citrusy, dried up prude who, instead of celebrating the fact that I fully own my body and use it however I want, with whomever I want, as many times and many kinky ways as I want, you're shaking your finger at me?
I think it's fantasy.
Bitch, stop playing in my face. I'm not gonna keep wanting you.
We can recoup the violating image and use it. You are not going to destroy this imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy by creating your own version of it.
After completing that show, another reason the show was called "Stop Playing in My Face" is because it was also, I was calling into question my own agency, what agency I did or did not have to even be creating this work about that community. But the people in my community and in my family were really important to me, and I felt like that work needed to be made. And I didn't want to assume that I got everything right. And so sort of the title of the show, Stop Playing in My Face, was like the question left in the room, was I or was I not playing in the face of the folks who I was making work about? And then as I continued to make that work, and some time passed, and I started a new body of work, I started to realize how that question wasn't important, because I wasn't the space that I was creating for my work was a non-binary space. And so it was a space where all genders, all people can be present. And I felt like there was really no need to sort of concern myself as much as I did with that, particularly when consulting with certain folks from the community whom I respect. And I went on to make this work. Well, not this work. I didn't make this work. I did not make this work. No, I didn't make this work. I made a work inspired by this work. I always loved this work, and I was looking at the images I made before, and I wanted to go from these faces to these fully embodied beings. And rather than looking at masks as a form of inspiration, I started to use African masks and sculptures in the work. And this work was really important for me to redo because this work, in a lot of ways, marks the beginnings of what we understand as Cubism, and really was heavily inspired by African art. And so it was sort of a reclaiming of that movement, because it was something that had been happening in the content far before Picasso went there. And so this was the recreation of that work. And these are more works from that series, where they went from being these faces to these fully embodied figures. And this particular work was sort of the embodied figures looking back at the previous work that I had made about them. And so they're sort of like experiencing the work. And through the image, through those figures looking forward looking at the image that in front of them, you see this sort of abstraction that's happening between that central figure's head and the breast of the figure in the picture, and there's sort of this face looking back. So it's sort of like looking back to look forward, sort of playing with perspective. Is that another image from that? Also, as a part of that show, I did some recreations of these stools from Central and West Africa. And the name of that show was called Reclaiming Our Time. And the stools really were a way for me to kind of invite viewers to have a seat and engage in meaningful dialogue around the work that they were looking at. Oftentimes when Black bodies are in museums and gallery spaces, there's this uneasiness. And I thought, what would it do to have these bodies be offered a seat upon entry? And so it was sort of a way to start dialogue within the space. For me, a lot of this work is about starting a conversation, and so it's really important to be in conversation with the people seeing it so that it can continue to grow, which is what I think all art is supposed to do, is to start a conversation. And so this was a physical way for me to make sure a conversation happens rather than people just kind of coming in, walking around, and leaving. The viewers were really invited to hang out. And so the work I'm working on now is a continuation of the ideas in that recent body of work, which is moving into a 3D space. So now those images that you saw, those embodied figures in those collages, I'm now working through dimensionally to make them actual sculptures in the space. But not only are they sculptures, the sculptures in a lot of ways are prototypes for a robot that I'm building. And the robot is really a way, again, I was thinking a lot about how this whole idea of agency and trying to imbue the work with as much agency as possible. What starts out as a face looking back to start a conversation about agency became these fully embodied figures. Now they're coming off the wall and they're in the space. What an artwork is supposed to start a conversation. What happens when the artwork can not only start but also participate in the conversation? And I think thinking about that has opened up a slew of other ideas in terms of thinking about race, gender, imperialism, capitalism, when thinking about this new race of beings that is upon us. From my research, we're about 15 to 30 years away from having robots in the home and in the world the way we understand them in sci-fi films. And there is this sort of naiveness in which the people who are creating these things have around what they're creating, sort of the way people who created the nuclear bomb, they're creating it with this sense of not really understanding that these things will be immediately weaponized as the blueprints are being, or the sort of drones and things of that nature who already exist are already being weaponized. And thinking about how who will be able to really manufacture these beings, because you have either they're really rich people or people who are going to weaponize them. So you either have a robot that's smarter than a human being that's being taught greed or being taught to kill. And another aspect of the work is just sort of thinking about how these beings are going to affect day-to-day life for certain people in terms of jobs, also how their lives are being affected as they become more sentient, and the kind of parallels between the history of Black people in America and these beings. When Black people came to America, we were technology. And so I'm thinking a lot about that as well. And so the work is in development now, and actually it will be shown next year at Fort Mason. And here is a blueprint for the robot that is to come. And it's called The Being. Thank you. Feel free to ask any questions. I'm gonna sit.
Hi, I have a quick question actually. In your video icon, I noticed there were a lot of I'm not sure if they were Jewish Star of Davids, but I was wondering what the significance of that might be.
Yeah, that was there really wasn't. I really just like the shape of that star. It really was nothing more than that. I knew I needed stars for creating that kind of spacescape, and I liked formally what that star looked like. And I was in a jewelry shop and I found it, and I thought, well, this is the star for this. It really there was no real reference to Jewish culture or anything like that. It was just formally I liked the way it looked, and it made sense in the composition. Yeah. Yes.
Abandon that you see through some of the performers that you set up. Where do you find it?
Yeah, for me, I find it. Oh. Yeah, sure. Oh, they didn't.
Where do you find your rapture in the work?
Well, the work is really rooted in improvisation. And so, like, for instance, in a work like Shade Compositions, where I'm conducting the women in the piece, what I'm trying to do is create a contemporary piece of music, and it's based on these culturally specific gestures. What I need is the sound, the snap, the that, but the narrative they put around that is up to them. So you have all these narratives happening on stage at any given time, and so there is this certain way in which, I am conducting, so there's this element of control, but actually in some ways there is no control because they have full freedom to, kind of bring those narratives to life the way they want, and I'm, composing them so that I can make music out of it. So there's this moment in which I'm composing them, and there's this kind of exchange back and forth, and that's when I start to feel the ecstasy. There's this moment that never fails in the piece when the gestures are just done to exhaustion, and they are emptied of all their cultural specificity, and they just become sound, and even all the performers start to move like a machine, and we're all in complete sync, and it's the only way I can describe it is this black magic moment. And that is the moment of rapture that I find in that piece. I also find that in 5, when I'm conducting the dancers in that piece. Also, in the process of editing, which is a very laborious process and often done in silo, you kind of have to, there's so much repetition with like rotoscoping and things like that. And some people might be like, oh my God, I hate doing that, but there is this sense of euphoria when you're just doing something, the repetition, collage is that way too, cutting out the thousands of images that make up one of these pictures. Those are the ways that I find rapture, but then also after making the work, experiencing it. Because in a lot of ways, I'm making the work that I want to see in the world, And so if I don't make it, then I can't have the experience. So, yeah.
Hi, I had a couple of questions, but I'm mostly thinking through my thoughts out loud. But earlier you said in some of the music videos in hip hop, you realize the role of women in those videos, how important those are when they're removed from the video is like basically all the power of it is like taken away, and it doesn't have the same meaning or doesn't have the same
it has no effect.
It doesn't have the same effect. And then in the videos that earlier you showed of your work, I was wondering, the women are kind of depicted as like supplements of for the herald or the king to be more of become more glorified, or there to be help the figure to be more, how do I say, become rise up, and then but they're never like kind of next to the figure, or the king is there but there's no queen, and then if the being king is not the point, then why there's a king at all? And I'm just like thinking the role of the woman there is either not being there is taking the power away, or being there is more of like being just a supplement to the whole thing.
Are you talking about the work King of Arms?
I'm like thinking about the whole work in a
but is there a specific work? Because there's a specific question. Because for me, the one of the conundrums, because I assume you're talking about King of Arms because that's the only one where you see, usually when you see the women in the work, it's them.
Yeah.
There's no king there, or there's usually not a guy there.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the work King of Arms, where you see me with the queen and another figure, these are people that I've been working with pretty much, I'm from over a decade. And so they're there because they're really, in a lot, they're my collaborators, right? And, but that has been sort of like a conundrum in the work because, as a Black male, there's all these negative names that are projected onto you. And as a sort of way of kind of reframing oneself is like, oh, rather than being a thug, rather than being a villain, rather than being a hood, to be a king, And sort of growing up, our parents tell us, you're a descendant of kings and queens and things like that. And so there was this want to kind of like take that on to kind of combat the trauma that's put on you. But then at the same time, once one starts to decolonize and realize that to be a king or a queen is a part of imperialism, which is connected to capitalism, which is connected to patriarchy, which is connected to, all these things, you realize that you can't really separate them. And so that's sort of a conundrum in the work in that, there is this desire to kind of take on that title, but that whole idea is complicated once you put Black bodies into it, And I think that's something that, is sort of why that work kind of ended with King of Arms and then shifted into the work Stop Playing in My Face and Reclaiming Our Time, because it was essentially reframing the work before so you see the journey, right? I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much. I'm down here.
Oh.
I have so many really good feelings and just like so much excitement in my body right now because I feel like I think across a lot of these intersections. So to see them moving through your work and to get this kind of retrospective glance is really like, all my synapses are firing. So my first kind of question comment was just about how like research intensive your practice is and wanting to like invite if you just have any like thoughts or reflections about what or like where that came from or how that impulse continues to show up and drive or like what that does that may be kind of being siloed in a studio just like on the material object of the art doesn't do. So like what is the place of research in your practice? Which feels like it's not really saying what I want to say. But so that's the first part.
Okay.
And then the second part is, as somebody I'm from Atlanta, I used to tell people I was related to Buffy the Body when I was in high school because she was dark-skinned and desirable and from Atlanta. So like I think I wanted to hear a little bit about that interview, which you shared a little bit more about too. And then also thinking about figures like Buffy, like the video vixen, like kind of these Black women, these consumed objects, as you referred to them earlier. Like I've been recently thinking a lot about them as cyborgs, so I'm wondering how, like in your vision for this robot, those kind of earlier meditations on Black femininity show up, if any, in what you're thinking through kind of Black folks as the original technology or as an original technology in modernity and like Black women's place in that whole scheme.
Mm-hmm. That was a lot of questions.
Sorry.
So I'm going to try my best to, I think the first part was research. Research is really important. And, usually it starts with an idea and then I just start to look for, like for instance with heraldry, I just became really fascinated with that as a design formula for an image and started to research that, which led to the history of it and how problematic it was, and then how I can, and then still being fascinated with the design for it, but being aware of how problematic it was, how could I subvert it and use it, kind of make it bend to my will, right? The same way I'm working with consumer images, which is really a very divisive thing. It's sort of, I'm taking these images that, people desire and then creating these images that are critical of these images, right? And so it's a tool in which, you know, it can pull the viewer in. Somebody might be connected to this one thing that they see in the overall composition, but by the time I have them in my grasp, you know, we're having a much deeper conversation than what they actually bargained for. I kind of got off topic. Then you said research, and then you said Buffy. Buffy was great. The call was all of probably like 30 minutes, but it was great. I knew an editor at Vibe at the time, and she had just done the cover with Catania, and through like endless emails and calls to this person, I finally got her number, was able to get on a call with her. And yeah, it was just me trying to figure out how she felt about being objectified. And she was just like, I don't feel objectified, because she was completely in control. And so it kind of changed the whole way one would look at, you know, girls in the urban model industry and just be like, oh, you know, they don't have any agency or anything like that. And it actually led to me starting to use magazines like that in my work. And what I found was really interesting is that most of the girls that are in that industry, they are entrepreneurs. So they photograph themselves, they show up to a shoot, they have full control, they know what they're gonna wear, and in the spread, they talk about whatever they wanna talk about. And one would think, like, in, let's say, like high fashion magazines like Vogue and things like that, these girls have no voice, they can't say anything, they're told what to do, and that's it. And I find it interesting that the Black girls, you know, have agency in their form of modeling, which is called urban modeling, but like in the more hegemonic space, which is more celebrated, they actually have no voice, you know, and the Black people are not. So that was an interesting thing to think about from that conversation with Buffy, and just kind of going down the rabbit hole of the urban model industry. And just the whole fact that it's called the urban model industry. What does that mean? I think that's just code for Black, you know? Urban, we all live in urban environments. Yeah, and then, what was the last? Yes, so I don't quite know. The piece is in early production, and for me, the being is not gendered. And so I guess what I'm really thinking about is, like, part of the thing we do as artists and scholars is try to unpack these complex notions of race and identity and gender and all these things. And I was thinking, you know, I mean, I know this is a very far-fetched idea, but what is it like to be in a post-race, post-gender, post-space, right? And I feel like the being offers a potential peek into what that can be like, because it's not gendered, it's not raced, it's a completely new being. And then you're able to look at the human condition and how, once we move past all those things, what is it about humans that are so compelled to dominate and enslave? And, you know, it's something that as a species we keep coming back to. And I hate to sound like a nihilist, but are these forthcoming beings the answer to what we're doing wrong? Are they here to erase us? Are they here to kind of clear the earth for new growth? You know, and then, because you think about this industry is on the rise, and you think about climate change, and you think about how the production of these types of machines will affect that, and how that will affect us. And you know that's going to be full steam ahead. That's the thing that everybody is, you know, kind of looking to fund rapidly, because the person who's able to master that will really have a lot of control. So yeah, I think for me, it's not, I think it's much more, it's moving past all of these questions from the previous work and really getting to what is the issue with human beings. I'm going to be working with a evolutionary psychologist on it, a bunch of really incredible programmers at MIT, and, you know, it's, you know, robotics is a collective practice, And so there's a lot of great minds coming together, and there'll be a lot of conversations that will inform what this being will be like. But its social contract with the internet, which is his brain, will definitely be based on the writings of bell hooks and people like Paulo Freire and Foucault, some Darwin. So yeah, you'll meet them next year. Yeah. They're also, I should say, also the being is being created with an inherent sense of dissonance too. That's also a part of it. Which is almost like trying to do that is automatically a failure because I'm building it, right? And so it will never really be free, but I want it to be aware of the fact that it will never be free and be critical of that.
Hello? Oh my gosh, that scared me. On that note, I want to thank Rashaad for this amazing lecture. We don't have any more time for questions. I know you all are like, ooh. Maybe you want to kind of give Rashaad a hand of applause and just thank him so much for coming. Thank you, A&D. Thank you, BAMFA. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate your presence and coming out to support such a visionary. You're amazing, Rashaad. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Good night, everybody.